What fitting way to what fitting better way to start today's show with that song September Sun, in memory of the late great Peter Steele from Typeonegative, Carnivore. Today being April 14th, 13 years that he has passed. You know what's crazy, man? It to me it always seems that it's almost timeless, really, man. It's almost, I mean, for me, because I'm such a humongous fan of his and the band and whatnot. And I'm sure other people can relate who feel the same way. That it just feels timeless sometimes. You know that no matter how many years go by, numerically, it it still feels like either so long that he's been gone or he just passed yesterday. I'm sure for those his family members and for those who have known him personally, probably it just feels like yesterday to some extent. But I know, like as a fan, for me, I think that the thing that I always think about when I think about his passing is the fact of what a large effect he had on music, especially in the metal genre, especially during the 90s and, of course, during the 80s, because for someone like me who discovered Typo Negative, I remember the date, 1995, I want to say, which is pretty much rather late to so many other fans and people who had known about them beforehand. Uh, it, it, you forget that he was around and doing so many other things, especially with Carnivore in the 80s and late 80s, early 90s, up to then. And when you really become infatuated with an artist, with a band, with a genre of music, and you go back and you look through the discography or their timeline of their life, you basically see so much of a large body of work that they were doing. And that, for me, was the experience with Peter. I wanted to just do an episode today based on, a tribute to him, just from a fan's point of view, man, a fan's heart and soul, man. Because again, for me, in '95 I was 15. I was born in '80, but I didn't, like I said, come to discover them until that time. And it's amazing. Sometimes I've said this so many times before, but there are times in your life when you come across others, whether it's an author, whether it's a teacher, whether it's it doesn't even have to be an artist. You come across someone who is saying, writing, singing, or doing something that you can really relate to. And I felt that way when it came to Typo Negative's music, especially the first album I was introduced to, of course, was Bloodykisses, because listening to 92.3, you would hear those metal rock blocks, and they were playing the hits from that album of those back in the day. And of course, it was Christian Woman and Black Number One. And when I discovered the album Bloodykisses, and you go into depth of it, when there were albums that you could read the lyrics to with some cool pictures, the more you listened to it and the more you read the lyrics in unison and you heard the music, the more hopefully you could tie into on an emotional, spiritual, and artful type of way. And I always felt that way when it came to their music, because I think that they were genius at tapping into an area that really there was lack of for that matter, especially during that time. But I think also too, I mean, there were other bands, of course, but they did it so wonderfully with their goth-like sound and the way they were able to kind of stand alone from the status quo of music at the time, and really not be so hardcore in the metal genre, and really not be so hardcore in the grunge genre, and really not have a foothold in a certain area, but they kind of had their own sound. So again, if you were a fan, hopefully you obviously identified the music with the music some type, way, or form, because it was unique. And his voice was unique. His lyrics were unique. They're still unique to this day. And I'll tell you the truth, and I'm sure so many of the people feel this way. Music for me has not been the same since he passed and since the band is no more. And I hate to say this, but I think it's a good thing that, of course, they decided not to go on without their lead singer. I feel, in my opinion, that sometimes there is a sacred spot for a lead singer within a band, and you really can't see them moving forward, or you really can't see the band come together as a whole and move forward and take on the same title. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, this is like one of those arguments. It worked for AC/DC, but here's the thing: one lead singer sounded exactly like the same, like the last lead singer. Now, it doesn't always happen. I know we have bands that are still going today that are still somewhat prominent. Now, Alice in Chains and Stone Temple Pilots, two of my all-time favorite bands of all time. I don't listen to a lot of the new stuff, not out of the fact that the lead singers, Lane Staley and Scott Weiland, are not there anymore. But I will say this, it does have a lot to do with it, for me at least personally, and that's not a knock at their current lead singers, because I have heard good things. But for me, it's not the same thing. It just doesn't feel the same way. I can't identify with the music. I could be wrong. It could change. But I just know that that's how I feel currently. Now, if, let's just say for argument's sake, typeonegative had gone on without Peter with a different lead singer, I don't think I would have been able to kind of identify with it. As genius and wonderful as Johnny Kelly, Kennyhickey, and joshsilver were in everything that they did in terms of the band, I don't think it would have been the same for me. I mean, I could be wrong, but that's just the way I feel. But again, I give them a lot of credit for calling it a day at a certain time and going on their own separate ways and doing other things in music. I think it's so wonderful when a group knows when it's over or when they're going to change and do something else. I think that's really important, and they're not taking advantage of things. And that's the one thing I've always respected about their band, is that artistically they never sold themselves out. And it's very rare in today's day, shape, and form in terms of music, in the world of music, that we see that. They never sold out, man. And I think that's one thing that's made them pass the test of time, keep on going, especially to younger fans, a younger generation, a different generation, I should say, and remain in the forefront. And I will say this too, and again, maybe I'm a little biased because I'm a huge Peter Steele fan. I always felt that he was one of the most misunderstood, underappreciated, underrated musicians and artists in all areas. And while, of course, there's a large group of us that obviously don't feel the same way, I just feel that when you look at music in a whole, he was in a whole different ballpark. I mean, when you go back and you read the lyrics to those songs, when you hear the genius and the wonderful sounds that came upon in their music, the unique sound, the camaraderie in their sound, there's only one group that did that. There's no one else that even comes close to me, for me, when it comes to them. And I know a lot of people like to group in certain other groups in that area, whether it's Lifeofagony or Biohazard. Two great groups, don't get me wrong, but not, typeonegative is typeonegative. I don't think anything even comes close or comes to be as unique in that genre. When you go back and you listen to each and every album, which is telling a different story, you look at the artwork, you read the lyrics. There was something so special and intimate about that time when you were able to do that. I remember just sitting in my car, going through the CD case and looking at all the art pictures carefully, reading the lyrics, trying to figure out, while listening to the music, trying to figure out the puzzle, trying to figure out the riddle, musically, artistically. What kind of story am I following? And each track had a different story to follow. And I know how each album kind of had a life of its own, whether it was, Bloodykisses, and whether it was October Rust, where Peter was talking a lot about certain relationships he had in his life, trusting people who haven't been good to you, and then moving on to things like Life is Killing Me, that had a lot to deal with death and whatnot, and then with the unfortunate passing of his dad, and then of course, going on to Dead Again, discussing the unfortunate death of his mom and close friends. It's amazing to see an artist's journey and where they're at in their headspace and kind of get on that ride and go with them. So that's one thing I always give them a lot of credit for, because they did that to a T. And in my opinion, it was never a way for them to capitalize. They did things on their own terms. And I think that artistically, that's always the most important thing to do, because as fans, we can identify with that a lot, especially if you had the privilege to go see them live in concert. Now, I had the privilege to do it 14 times. I wish I could have done it a lot more, as I would have. And I always noticed, and they were big on this too, was that they never oversold themselves to the point where fans weren't able to go to see their shows because they were charging $80 to $100 to a show, as we see so much today, which is funny because I know there's been a large outcry in the high prices of concerts. I know the Bruce Springsteen, if you're a Bruce Springsteen fan, there's been a large outcry from fans talking about the exuberant prices per ticket that they're charging and how certain people can't afford it, especially I know at MSG with The Cure coming there, looking at some of the ticket prices, it's extremely high. And unfortunately, certain people can't afford that. But I noticed that typeonegative always stuck to the fact that they played places and charged prices that they knew their fans could come to. So whether that meant, if you were able to go see them at lamours, I was only able to go see them once, and it wasn't in the heyday. You're so lucky to have done that, or you were able to go see them at other places. I saw them, what was it, Roseland, which was amazing. I think Cold Chamber was on that same tour, and another group, Witch Moon, I think at the time. I remember looking at the flyer and looking down at it, and there was some other band on it. Cold Chamber was definitely there, but I knew at the time it was really funny. It was a really hot, cute Gothic chick, and I think she gave me the flyer with Witch Moon or somebody on it. I forgot the name, who else was playing on it, but yeah, I was able to see them at Roseland. I also saw them at I think it was the PlayStation Theater in the city. I think that was one of the last times I saw them. The Fillmore East, whatever the hell that's called now. I saw them back-to-back nights. I saw them in Jersey. I can't think of the name of the venue. It's a very famous venue in terms of a show. It was them, and I forgot who else was on that venue. All standing venue. You know the name, or not? I can't think of the name of it. Took me forever to get there because the traffic was an absolute bitch there and back, but it was well worth it. But the prices were never that large, which was great because you paid a decent price, a low price to go see them, and you saw them play, and you saw a really good show, and you got to interact with them, hopefully. I also had the pleasure of going to see them in person at Duff's when Duff's was at its original spot. One time they were doing a meet and greet. The second time was for the re-release of Dead Again, which had the Red Cover album on it. And, both times it was great because what better than to go see your favorite band in person and meet Johnny Kelly, Joshsilver, Kennyhickey, and Peter Steele. So that's one of the things I always really loved about them. They really never changed who they were. And I wonder if that had to do with them commercially not being as big as they commercially could have been or should have been, in terms of the agenda in the States, because I know overseas in Europe they were humongous. They were doing the Donegan Festival or other festivals. They were huge there. And it also, I think it had to do with the fact that we've seen the decline of so many wonderful musical festivals, such as Ozzfest, where they used to play, or, there's no more Dysfunctional Family Picnic, which I don't think they played at. But I think there would have been more of those things in the States, especially today, had Peter would have been alive, how great it would have been for them. But again, that's the thing I always respected about them. They never sold themselves out. And there are groups like that. One that comes to mind was Motorhead with Lemmy. That's another group who I felt never sold themselves out. Never, kind of sold themselves out in terms of their musical intentions, their musical beliefs of what they were singing about. And it always brings to mind, going back to talking about what a great songwriter and lead singer he was his voice, of course, which, of course, there's a funny-ass YouTube video, a couple of funny-ass YouTube videos where you see this opera singer kind of trying to, look into Peter's voice and saying what a unique voice he was. Or if you see a new generation of fans discovering his music, they're always interested with the voice and the sound and how it's kind of unique. That's one thing that I think always drew me in, because I didn't know what the hell they looked like when I first heard them until I got the album and opened it up and started looking at it. And then, to my surprise, he didn't live too far from me, man. I mean, he lived in Brooklyn, which, I knew the area really well because all my family came from there. And, not too far from, right near the high school there. He lived right down the block. So, it was funny when I had gone to look at his house, like so many other fans had done. I sound like such a fucking fanboy right now. I couldn't believe how close he lived. That's crazy. And when I had actually had the pleasure to meet them and talk about where I was from, they were like, "Oh wow, like you're really close to us and shit like that." They knew Howard Beach. I think it was Johnnykelly who knew New Park Pizza, which was a trip. And so it was funny to hear how close they came. You know how close we were from Brooklyn to Queens and their roots. That's another thing I always appreciated was their roots. Their roots being Brooklyn. My roots are all Brooklyn. My whole family was born and bred in Brooklyn. All parts, whether it was Bed-Stuy or in the other areas, one way or another, we moved all around and came to Queens. So that's another thing I always appreciated. And then, of course, going back into their catalog of music, learning from them all the other wonderful bands that had Brooklyn-based roots or had passed through Brooklyn, and who were huge when you think about certain groups who came and performed at lamours. I mean, that's one of the biggest regrets I guess I have. Well, nothing I could do about it is being born when I was born, but had I would have been born early, I would have had the pleasure to go and see so many groups that came through and played there, whether it was Metallica or, everybody and anybody else who played. That's where one of the places you played. I guess it was like a CBGB for Brooklyn. It sucks that we don't have that no more, especially in today's day and age where we're trying to discover new wonderful bands. We don't have that as much, and I think that's much needed, where we need to have an outlet like that. Because again, I think in music it's become so commercially different that what's selling now wasn't the thing that sold in the early 2000s. What was in the 2000s, that was the status quo that sold. Sure shit wasn't what we had in the 90s, and likewise and back. And I wonder, a lot of the times, had Peter been alive and the band still been together, where they would be today. Would they still be together? I know towards the end of Type O Negative, one of the last shows I saw, Josh was no longer touring with them, or he wasn't on that tour. They had a different person touring, and I remember Peter saying in an interview had Josh had become an EMT, which is awesome, and gone on to do something else. I don't know, maybe he saw the forest from the trees, or maybe wanted to change a venue for a short amount of time or whatever. But that being the case, I wonder would they still have been around today. I really hope so, because there are so many other groups similar to them that are still going, whether it's Danzig. I know the Misfits are still coming back around with the original lineup. Metallica is still there. Guns N' Roses has come back. Kiss is on tour once again. Tool, all the great bands that we love from the 90s. So I would hope that they would still be around touring and producing new music. I know that when he did die, there was word that they did have some new songs, or they were in the midst of working on new songs. I wonder if we'll be able to get to see or hear those new things come out. The really cool thing is that Kenny and Johnny are still going strong, and they've had the ability to play in various different groups, which is awesome, because they're both phenomenal. One a phenomenal guitarist, the other one a phenomenal drummer. And I think the more you go back through the catalog and listen to them, you appreciate them a lot more. It's just the way it is sometimes when you don't have that in front of you anymore. I will say this, in terms of having that in front of you, I got to see them 14 times, and they were absolute kick-ass all 14 times that I saw them live. In fact, I introduced them to my middle brother, Steve, who is a huge fan as well, and we had the pleasure of going to shows, and I remember him telling me how they were one of the few bands that sounded so great live, and just as much as they did on CD, especially when they did a lot of their hits and whatnot. And great, I think that's always an important aspect to do, is to kind of rate a group, a band, a singer live. I've had the pleasure of seeing a lot of groups and bands and singers live. I don't really remember having a negative experience for a lot of the people from the 90s that we love. I saw STP, I saw Soundgarden, obviously Type O Negative, Rob Zombie, Godsmack, Limp Bizkit. Hey man, you made this, but Limp Bizkit was kick-ass live. I respect and like them a lot. The Deftones, Seven Dust. I'm not trying to go through the thing and pat myself on the back. I'm just trying to name the groups. that I've seen from the 90s, and all of them are great. Most recently, I saw the Smashing Pumpkins and Jane's Addiction, and they were amazing. I gained a new respect for them. So again, one thing that was always important to me is when you go see them live, how they play, and Typo was amazing live. One of the highlights of my fanboy Typo Negative life was seeing them in concert and hearing them do Wolf Moon, which sounded phenomenal. I remember a show at Roseland that I saw. They opened up the fucking show with Kill All the White People, which was a fucking trip because they weren't the first group to open up. Me, and I mentioned him before, a very good friend who's a music aficionado, especially when it comes to Typo Negative and 90s music, Frank Ferry. We were outside. I think he was enjoying a cigarette, and all of a sudden we were waiting for them to come on, and we heard the opening riffs for Kill All the White People. Everyone was looking at each other going, they're not opening with Kill All the White People, are they? And we rushed inside, and there was a fucking nice little pit going. But yeah, live they were absolutely kick-ass, man. And, you know, it's funny with groups, what makes a group famous, what doesn't make a group famous, why is one group here, one group there. It's like the classics with anything, right? You ever wonder why, and it comes in terms of books, what they consider to be the classics, like whether it's The Pearl or whether it's The Catcher in the Rye or Pearl Buck's The Good Earth, or what makes classics classics? I always wonder, like, who made that choice? Who are we to, like, who is anyone to say what's what and what to follow and what not? I think a lot of the times it's kind of subjective. In music, obviously, because of the time periods and everything when it started, when it really took off, like for me at least, and I think universally, and again, I'm very biased here, but I'm sorry, it's just the way it is. Elvis is the end all be all. I mean, that's what really started everything. The rebellious side of music, the not listening to what was going on then, doing your own thing, following your heart, Johnny Cash, and then on. But in terms of this genre, what became like what was the thing? Like, you know, in the 80s and the early 90s, depending on where you are, and again, that's one of the great aspects of 90s music is that there was a little bit of everything. Bob Dylan was still going strong. Willie Nelson, when hasn't Willie Nelson been going strong? George Harrison was going strong. Paul McCartney. You had, of course, all the great grunge bands, the Big Four from Seattle, groups from New York. The punk scene was huge. The metal scene was huge. So it was this great melting pot of music at that time that for some reason or another, that kind of has narrowed down today and has become this different thing that I can't even identify with anymore. I mean, you really got to be a fucking archaeologist to go find really good music. You got to have the what do you call it? The tools to go and find it. But that was one of the things I think that at that time they stood out because they weren't really grunge. And there was nothing, especially as their albums went on. I mean, yeah, there were songs that sounded like Type O Negative, but look what we opened the show. We opened it with September Sun. I remember hearing that song thinking, wow, this doesn't sound like anything they've ever done. And then, somewhat in the middle of the song, they came upon and did this different riff that kind of sounded very Type O Negative. Like, that's another genius part of their group, was how they were able to change sounds with these elongated songs that went on for 10 minutes, 11 minutes, 12 and more. And we've seen a lot of them on several different albums. And once again, when you saw them live, if you had the pleasure of seeing them live, it was amazing because it was just you're watching this body of music take its own shape and form while you're there. It's not watered down like on radio edit versions that really fucking suck. You're there to appreciate that long minute song in its entirety live, and you appreciate everything so much more, whether it's the vocals or the music. It's one of the many aspects that we don't have anymore. And for me, and I digress, I'm sorry to ramble, but that's one of the things I miss. I remember when he died thinking, as a fan, music will never be the same, and it hasn't. I mean, maybe it's just me again because I'm biased, but I just feel like that was the last part of a special era that died. And of course, from that time, and I've dedicated a show to this when we've talked about the several artists who were very prominent in the 90s who passed away, whether it's Scott Weiland, Chris Cornell, Lane Staley, obviously Peter Steele, and so forth. Unfortunately, it's never been the same. And the funny thing about those artists is, Cornell, Scott Weiland, they died after Peter. Lane Staley obviously died before him. But again, it makes things even more special in terms of the music of that time, and it makes it even more special per the artist. Look, there's Alice in Chains, Lane Staley, and there's Alice in Chains post Lane Staley. That's my opinion. There's Stone Temple Pilots, Scott Weiland. There's Stone Temple Pilots post Scott Weiland. I don't know any other way. Okay, that's just me. But again, I think Peter was just one of those unique artists that had the ability and the freedom to write about what he felt and to kind of turn those into songs, turn those into their own story. And the guy was brave enough to really do that and, live and die by it. I mean, that's very rare. And then discuss it in so many interviews that you can see on YouTube or anywhere else, on Instagram, where he talks about that a lot of his songs come from real life places. I mean, that to me is always the real true artistic way. And another great thing was that he was actually a regular person. I have the honor, pleasure, and luck to have met many members of his family and to still be friends with them. Wonderful people. And they would always talk about how he was a regular person. In fact, when I had gone to his house one of the many times, like a fanboy that I am, and right down the block, or 2 blocks, I should say, from Edward R. Murrow High School, where he went to high school, there was, I forgot the name of the avenue there, where there were various different places that have still been there to this day since back in my parents' time. And I recognized 2 or 3 of the spots. I think one of them was a pizzeria. And, I'm like, oh, my God, this is where am I? And his family members would say, yeah, he was a regular person. It wasn't like he was living this rock star life in hiding or, thinking in a tower where he couldn't be where others were. That's something I always appreciated, especially too, was his relationship with the fans. If you had the pleasure, honor, and luck to go and see him or meet him, when I met him, I mean, he was absolutely the most down-to-earth person. Wanted to ask about you and talk about you. What are you doing? Spend as much time as he could with you. That's the things you really, the saying, you hope you never meet your idols. Well, that didn't go for when I met him. And I think these days where we're with the social media, power of social media, and we see a lot of the people we look up to, we see a lot of them hanging themselves, whether it's, on Twitter, on Instagram, or this and that, saying something or acting a certain way. He wasn't like that. When I met him, he couldn't have been nicer. He couldn't have been cooler. He couldn't have been more welcoming, couldn't have been more funnier. That's one of the things that always holds a special place in your heart when the person's not here anymore, is how did they treat you when they saw you? They didn't treat you like an oddity or a fan. They treated you like you knew them. I won't mention names. I don't like to do that. But there was a certain musician that I went to go see with the Russian, a.k.a. or Melanie, a.k.a. Skunsa, a.k.a. the Russian. We went to go see a certain band with a certain lead singer who you'll know really well, who she liked. Wasn't my cup of tea, although I did like one of their songs. This person also happens to be an artist and more just music. I won't say any more. At the end of the show, you had a chance to go see him. He was sitting behind a table, 4 bodyguards bigger than the Verrazano Bridge. And I remember her asking him nicely, can I please take a picture of you? And him being a dick saying, I don't know, can you? Which kind of made me almost snap and want to smack him in his mouth. That wasn't the case with Peter, man. He was very cool, especially if you weren't too knowledgeable about him. He was always friendly. When I went to Duff's, I was looking for him to greet. He was the last one I was able to greet. Go figure. You couldn't miss him because of his height. He was amongst the crowd. I figured, oh, shit. He's like right with everybody, man, which was really cool, which couldn't have been easy if you're him. It's never, excuse me. As a fan, it's never easy when that person you really respected and look up to is no longer there, especially when you had the chance to meet them and you lived in the same time when they were still going strong live. it sucks, man, when that era comes to an end. And on Halloween, you used to look forward to going to see Typonegative in concert because you knew that's when they would come around. And it sucks, man, and it's not like that anymore. When Halloween comes around every year, I get a little glum. Glum is such a fucking weird word. Who invented glum? It sounds like a pair of socks. I don't know why. I got my glums on. Anyway, every Halloween comes around, you're always, you're getting into the mood. You feel the feeling in the air, autumn, crisp. It always reminds me of their music, and it sucks that there's no Typonegative to go see anymore. So that definitely blows, leaves a hole in you. But I think that as time goes on, my hope is that their music just keeps on gaining attention with new listeners, and a new generation, because the music was that unique and wonderful. And I think as an artist, as was he, a very unique, misunderstood person, especially when you can appreciate where they come from and their background and everything. You see it so many other times with so many other groups. You see it when someone from the group has passed away. And again, I'm always curious to know, what is it that puts certain people in the spotlight and others, I guess, not? Is it an agenda thing? Is it taste? Is it the in crowd, like high school? I kind of feel it is to some extent, because again, I remember listening to them. I think Howard Stern, who was a huge fan of Typonegative and had them on a couple times, would talk about, how come you guys aren't bigger? I've had people listen to them and say, well, this is really good. Like, where do I, and be surprised that they weren't this commercial machine, which I guess they didn't want to be. But again, to be fair, they were everywhere, man. They were on Beavis and Butthead. You can see that. I mean, they were at the ozzfests. Their videos were great on MTV, whether it's Christian Woman, Black Number One. So I never know what it is that puts a group, a band, a writer, a this, a that, into the next stratosphere. And I like to think that it happens for a certain reason, because artistically, that's not where they want to be. Like, you take Bob Dylan for example, one of the greatest singer-songwriter, could be the greatest singer-songwriter ever. And, as big as he is, I think Bob Dylan is in control of Bob Dylan. I saw him a couple years ago. One of the 2 or 3 times I saw him live. One was at Jones Beach. The other one was in Prospect Park. Now, that's not the Garden. That's not USB Arena, which wasn't there at the time. That wasn't the Meadowlands. Smaller, more personal venues. So I think singer-songwriters like him are still in control of who they are. That's one thing I've always respected, and I think that was the way it was with Peter and Typonegative. I remember back in the day when Rolling Stone was a music magazine. I don't read that anymore. It's just too much politics for me. I'm not into politics. But they used to rate the albums when they came out. And not that I ever went by what someone who I don't know, how they rated the album for me to listen to. They had nothing but good things to say. I think when it was World Coming Down, they had rated it high. And just let me say, on World Coming Down, to me, it was always one of my most favorite albums by Typonegative, because I think it was there. It really delved into the dark side of Peter and the band, especially when he talked about the drug use or, death in the family or people close to him. That's another thing I always respected about him, is he was very in touch with his dark side, which I think most people should be. You got to be in touch with the dark side, because, the balance of power with the light side, you got to know that it exists. By pretending, it doesn't make anything better. But obviously, you don't want one to kind of just be in control of the other. But there's nothing wrong with that. And that's one thing he definitely really was. He was really in touch with that dark side, his feelings, and all that had come through his life. I mean, what a life, what a journey, man. Was he one of 6 right? Seventh of 6 girls. That's interesting. For me, I have a little sister and 2 older brothers, so I can only imagine how she felt having all this testosterone, especially me, kind of no boys in the house, da 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 da. Yet, like, my sister's the boss, man, today. Without a doubt, if we had a corporation, she'd be in charge. But I can only imagine, how it must have been growing up with 6 older sisters. That had to be kind of different, right? And then comes the boy, and I know that they were a big inspiration on him in terms of music. That is awesome because he was born in 62. So you think about that, he came along in the 60s, and it's sort of still the Beatle era, the Stones era. It was, and goes on to Elvis's comeback, and then on. So all the inspirations he had, and I know he said how his sisters would play a lot of the hits of the days, which they would band or would go on to cover later on. And of course the 70s, where Black Sabbath got bigger, and you had all these other groups that were coming along. So that must have been interesting to see, especially coming from his parents' side. I believe his parents had to be probably maybe into a lot of the big band music, whether it's Count Basie, Glenn Miller, like my grandparents were. And, you take into consideration all this inspiration and music around you, whether you like it or not. It is some sort of inspiration, I think, and how he was able to mold his own sound out of everything. That was always interesting to me. And of course, it had a lot to do with what he was around and listening to, whether it was, Sabbath, the Beatles. I know that the Beatles played a huge role for him. And I think that, again, too, when typo really started to take off, I don't think that there were too many groups that they could really put themselves in with. I know I had heard him say that in various interviews. I know on several tours they toured with Motley Crue. Like I said, Cold Chamber was one of the bands I saw them tour with. Then there were a couple of other groups, bands that I saw them tour with that I wasn't really familiar with, to be honest. But I think that they put themselves in places on certain tours with groups that they could identify with, and some they could not. When they did Ozzfest was interesting because I know he was close with Ozzy Osbourne, Peter, and he well respected Peter's band, and Peter, of course, typonegative. And it's amazing when you think about it too. Another thing is, think about the music from typonegative that got into movies. I'm sure Peter never, and the group never thought about that, but I could name so many of them. I remember seeing, I've said this before, what's that movie, I Know What You Did Last Summer, and the opening credits are typonegative Summer Breeze, which is probably one of the best covers I've ever heard in my life. On that note, I will say that they did the best covers of songs I've ever heard. Other than Elvis, in my opinion, they covered songs and made it their own, just like Elvis did, whether he did Bridge Over Troubled Water or, My Babe from Little Walter. That's what typonegative for me did in terms of covering songs. They made it their own. So Summer Breeze, If I Needed Someone, Day Tripper, you name it, man. They killed it, made it their own. So again, going back to movies, yeah, I mean, I said, I Know What You Did Last Summer, Freddy versus Jason. You hear Electrocutes playing. So many other movies, man, and projects and whatnot. It's you don't take into consideration, I guess, when you're not a fan. But when you're a music fan, I think, and you're objective, you do take it into consideration. When you are a fan, it's even more to you. So it's going to be on the tip of your tongue or the edge of your mind always when there's a naysayer or someone that doesn't know. But it's really cool to see online that there are so many groups and so many pages dedicated to Peter. I know there are so many people that put up these videos and pictures from his family or otherwise that I've never seen, that a lot of people have never seen. I guess it's on a lot of footage that's never been seen. I think that's great, man. because again, I think it's well deserving, obviously, as a person and as a musician, as an artist. Look, man, Type O Negative is my favorite band of all time, hands down. As a band, Type O Negative is there. I mean, for me, I have my groups that I love, and Type O Negative is my number one. Type O Negative to me is the true romance of movies for me. It's my favorite movie of all time. They're at the top of the list. And then it's, of course, it's them. It's Stone Temple Pilots. It's the Doors, the Beach Boys, the Rolling Stones, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains. For me, the list goes on. I said the Beach Boys. I'm a huge Beach Boy fan, by the way. Isn't it amazing how we just kind of mix everything together? But again, it sucks even more for we fans who don't have the music anymore, in terms of the live version or in terms of current. And, I think another great thing is when you go back in time in Peter's life timeline, you see how he started. And I've said this before, where Carnivore was. And then you saw how it took a turn and became what Type O Negative was. Of course, Slow, Deep, and Hard to me sounds like a kind of transition, a slow transition from Carnivore over. And then, of course, as Type O Negative albums go on, whether it's, Origin of the Feces, which to me is a phenomenal album in itself, tongue-in-cheek with the live sound, which took me forever to figure out, by the way, because I'm a fucking blockhead. But you see the transition the music made, even up to Deadagain. Like I said, having September Sun there, that didn't sound like a prototypical Type O Negative song. It sounded like something else. So they were phenomenal at doing that. And again, trying to make a key point on the way they were able to change sounds in certain songs, like whether it was These Three Things or Tripping a Blind Man. I always loved the way the songs would transition. Same thing with All Hail and Farewell to Britain. I mean, to me, I can't understand people who are not fans. And again, maybe I'm biased because I love them, but I just can't understand how you're not a fan, especially the music and especially of Peter's voice and the things he was talking about. I mean, look, to me, there are certain songwriters that come along that put together things that it can only be a certain way and it can't be changed. I mean, when you go back and you look at the lyrics to some of his songs, All Hallows Eve, even Halloween in Heaven. I mean, what's that whole thing? Bonham on Vokes, Entwistle on bass, on guitar Hendrix, right? Lennon sits in, where's his friend George? And then there's the whole thing. I love when he says, Elvis ain't dead. Elvis ain't here. He's not dead, whatever it is. And other lyrics, All Hallows Eve. That's the first time I've ever heard Saint Lucifer, hear me praying to thee on this eve of all saints. High be the place, but then nothing is free. But I forgot the rest. High be the place, then nothing is free. My soul I gladly trade. When I first heard that was fucking mind-blowing. I've never heard that in my fucking life. So if you were drawn to it for the lyrics as well as for the music, you really tapped into something interesting. And again, you could talk about so many other songs that he wrote that had that in it. I mean, think about I Know You're Fucking Someone Else, or Unsuccessfully Coping with the with Infidelity there, or think of Pain. Even his version of Hey Pete, he talks about the train ride to Coney Island, all that stuff. I mean, it's unique, it's interesting, it's one of a kind. It's one of those reasons why we loved him and his music. So, man, you can't. There are so many different areas you can go down when it comes to him. Of course, you can always go and visit his gravesite. I know it's a public thing by now, but I don't like to give out. That's it's not my business to give out that information because it's a family plot, and hopefully everybody respects it and knows where it is. But you can always go visit it. And which is kind of eerie, man, especially when you lived in a time when the person was alive or you had the pleasure to see the person live. It's always eerie, even whether it's a family member or a friend or someone you hardly knew. When you go and visit them and they're not there anymore and you see the stone, I think that's always interesting. But yeah, I wanted to just dedicate a show to him today. I think, it's the least I could do for someone who I looked up to, whose music really identified with how I was feeling as a person at that time and now. It's funny too, because I think that no matter how many times I go back and listen to it, I still feel the same way. And I've said this before. It's kind of like when you finally find that there's something that you can relate to in this world, a person, a book, a thing. You're like, oh shit, finally. And I think that's the thing with music. And it doesn't always just have to be a certain band. It could be a certain song, it could be a certain sound, it could be a genre, what have you. But for me, it was them. And it was the lyrics and the music with a lot of it. And it's wonderful. Fun fact for me was that I used to dance around getting myself pumped up for football games in high school, listening to Kill All the White People. I think that's perfect song to to do it. When I go train, which I got to get to in a little bit, and I want to hit it hard, I usually put on We Hate Everyone or, Too Late for Apology, something like that. Or I'll delve around, maybe do some Pain, maybe do I Know You're Fucking Someone Else, Prophet of Doom, what have you, man. The pickings keep going on and on. They're definitely not slim, but Greenman, as Peter was known, man, he is missed big time by his family, by his bandmates, by his fans, obviously, and the music world. Definitely sucks not having him anymore. But I guess, in a sense, it's nice to see everybody, of course, always remember him. I know his family has a tree dedicated to him in Prospect Park, which I've seen. They also have there's a bench, I think it's still there, with his nameplate on it. Because for those of you that don't know, he worked for the Department of Parks, spent a great deal of his time working for the city in the Department of Parks and whatnot. And what better? Hence be the name Greenman, right? A guy who identified so big with nature and everything like that. What better a job? But yeah, something dedicated in his memory today. Would have been, what is it now? Like we said, 13 years gone. Sucks. He was only 47 when he died. Way too young. Would have been great to see what he was still gonna unleash on the world, man. But all right, Beast is out today, remembering the great Peter Steele. Later.